Better. There we go. Well, hello and welcome to What Agencies and Families Need to Know About Background Checks. I'm Mike Coffey, president of Imperative Information Group, and we are a background screening company based in Texas serving corporate clients across the country. But through our PFC caregiver and household screening brand, we also serve nanny agencies, domestic staffing agencies, and families and estates across the country as well in screening their employees. Today, we're going to cover a lot of information because, quite honestly, at the most recent Association of Premier Nanny Agencies conference, I got so many questions. I tried to cram them all into one webinar. So this will be drinking from a fire hydrant, but I do want to cover as much as we can. But then my slides are mostly pictures, but there are going to be notes attached to each one of them. So here in a day or two, once we've got everything sorted out, we will share with all the registrants actual notes that will help you. So you don't have to write everything down as we go. I'll make sure you get fairly verbose notes that are hopefully helpful. So my background real quick is I'm an HR guy who, after starting my career in corporate HR, worked in aerospace and healthcare, also had a couple entrepreneurial things along the way. Then I had an HR consulting firm, and then 24 years, I guess, in, no, 22 years in January, and no, 24 years in January, to serve one client's needs, a nationwide financial services company. We got into the background screening business to help that client. And now, of my 20 plus employees, all of them are really focused on different kinds of due diligence related to people. So employment background checks is a big piece of it for both corporate clients and, as I said, families, but also we do due diligence for private equity firms and accounting firms and others like that. So we are real deep in the people information business. So the first I'm going to cover the legal issues concerning background checks for both nanny agencies, domestic staffing agencies, and families. And then we'll get into the content of what is actually in a background check, because people say, I want a background check, but don't know what they're really getting. And so hopefully we'll make you a better consumer of background checks in this process. And then we'll dive into that and then talk about some other practical issues related to the use of background checks in domestic staffing. So to get started, let's talk about the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Now, the FCRA, Fair Credit Reporting Act, is a federal law that governs how employers use information that they buy from third parties like PFC or Imperative. And anytime an employer or anybody is buying information about a prospective employee or current employee, the Fair Credit Reporting Act applies. So ignore the word credit in Fair Credit Reporting Act. It really should be Fair Consumer Reporting Act, but when the law was passed in the early 70s, the only real people who were doing background checks of any kind were credit bureaus. And so that's why they call it the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And the FCRA does cover a lot of stuff outside of employment-related background checks. It's a consumer report is anything related to consumer lending, insurance underwriting, or employment. So, or information collected for those purposes that's used for some other purpose is a consumer report under the law. It's not a really hard law on the employer side to comply with. And if you're working with a professional background screening company, they're going to make it pretty easy on you because they're going to give you the forms, and we'll talk about some of that. And they're going to just generally make sure that you're compliant because that protects them. Now, if you're working with a background screening company that's got low customer service and doesn't really pay attention to a lot of that, then as an employer, you want to pay a lot more attention to it. But especially when we're working with families or, a lot of nanny agencies or small businesses, they don't have the time to become experts in this. And so our firm or any screening company is usually going to invest the time to make sure that the systems are in place to help their clients comply. But we're still going to go through some of the compliance stuff, both on the compliance stuff on my end a little bit, which is really a lot deeper than what we'll get into, and then the compliance stuff on the employer side. So the first thing you need to know is that the FCRA has limitations on what the background screening company or the consumer reporting agency can tell an employer. The big news is that criminal convictions under federal law, I can include a criminal conviction in a background check, regardless of how old it is. Criminal convictions where the person was actually found guilty are reportable forever under the FCRA. But then when you get beyond that, there are other issues, and I'll bring these up. Like I said, criminal convictions are reportable forever under federal law. But not everything else, non-criminal convictions, so like cases that ended in deferred adjudication or was dismissed or arrest records, something like that, civil cases, liens and judgments, negative employment information. If a former employer fired somebody for cause 7 years and 1 day ago, I may not be able to tell the employer about it. And so there's a 7-year limit on all non-criminal conviction information that may be potentially negative. And so the variance there depends on what the person's going to make. If they're going to make more than $75,000 a year, there are no limits. And now we see here $75,000 a year, and that sounds like not a really high annual wage, but this is a very old law and they've never really updated it. And so that's kind of what's happened there. That $75,000 used to be a highly compensated individual, and it's really not anymore. But that's just the way the law reads. And so, and even in domestic staffing, we just completed a really big project for a client hiring a house manager. And so that house manager was going to make much more than $75,000 annually for this estate. And so there were some things in this person's distant past that they didn't think were going to show up on the background check. And to be honest, they were a little miffed when it did. But fortunately, the employer saw that it really wasn't relevant. But as we'll talk about in a little while, until the employer knows about it, they can't decide if it's relevant or not. And it's certainly not my job to determine if it's relevant. So sometimes there'll be something in there that's really stupid, a shoplifting conviction from 30 years ago. If we see it, we're going to report it to the client, even if they wouldn't be interested in it. Because they may be, maybe they asked the applicant about it and about any criminal history at all, and the applicant said, no, I've never had anything. And then you find out that they did have something they were embarrassed about and they didn't tell the truth. And so those kind of issues can happen. So from the employer point of view, one of the first things you've got to do is get the applicant's authorization to run the background check. So under the FCRA, the employer has to disclose to the individual before they ever run the background check. Oh, let me go backwards. Before they ever run the background check, that they're going to procure a background check, a consumer report for employment purposes, and they have to get the individual's authorization. And so this sounds like pretty straightforward. The problem is that this disclosure has to be on a document that's used exclusively for the purposes of making the disclosure and collecting the authorization. Now, some employers still use paper, but like almost all of our clients use our automated system so that you can put the applicant's name and email address in the system and it'll fire off an email to the applicant and then give them a secure way to log into our system so that they can receive their disclosures and give their authorization and provide their personally identifiable information, their name, date of birth, social security number, previous employer contact information, all that stuff that the employer may or may not have received up to that point. And then it's all automated. Plus, some jurisdictions have unique disclosures or unique authorization language. Some states have that, and even some cities have that. Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York have unique requirements around some of that. And so while that's not federal law, where we're aware of those things, and they're constantly changing, and we'll talk about that in a bit, we incorporate those into our system so that the applicant gets everything. So the employer doesn't have to worry quite so much about all the local compliance stuff. And in that case, it's all electronic, and you know, it's certainly before the background check gets ordered, the applicant's given all the appropriate consents. But if you're using a paper form, it's important to realize that, as I said, that disclosure document has to be used exclusively for the purposes of disclosing to the individual that you're going to procure a consumer report, getting their authorization, and you can collect their PII, name, date of birth, social, that kind of address, those kinds of things on that form. But you can't have additional information at all, regardless of what it is, on that piece of paper. So there have been employers large employers who've been sued in their class action lawsuits by plaintiff lawyers who love the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And so you see kinds of language like releases of liability or statements that I understand my employment's at will, I can quit my employment, or it can be terminated at any time, those kind of things. And that's all good language to have, just not on this form. The back of your employment application and your process someplace else, that's great, but do not put it on that disclosure document, because that will get you in trouble, and you'll be out of compliance with the FCRA just on its face. So you order the report, your background check company processes the report and gives it back to you. And you look at it and, oops, there's something here that's not right. The applicant told me they didn't have a criminal history, but here's a criminal history. Or they told me they graduated from this college, but this college has never heard of them. Or this previous employer threw them under the bus and said that this is not somebody we'd recommend for employment for these reasons. So when you get to that point, when you get a report and there's something that may result in a negative employment action, an adverse employment action, then the employer has some responsibilities before you communicate to the applicant that you're not going to hire them. You have to give them a copy of their report, a summary of their rights under the law before you take an adverse employment action. And again, to help our clients, and most screening companies do this, ensure their compliance, we will, there's a way in our system, you just push a button and it sends an email to the applicant. And again, they can log into the system and receive a copy of their report and their rights under the law. Some employers, and I think this is a really great idea, some employers will request that we send the information to them, their summary of rights and their background check results to them immediately. At the same time that we send it to the employer, send it to the applicant. That way we know, regardless of what happens down the road, the applicant's already received this information, because the law just says that before you take the adverse action, you've got to give them a copy of their rights and a copy of their law. So why not just give it to them every time? Because they can always come to us and request it, and I don't have any choice but to give it to them. So the law requires that I do that. So why not just give it to them? In fact, when we're working with families who come to our website just to order one background check, that's great. But our process is to help our clients, not give the rope to our clients to hang themselves. So we automatically, when the report is completed, we send a copy to the employer and we send a copy to the consumer or the applicant at the exact same time. So, but you want to make sure before you take the adverse employment action or communicate to the applicant you're not going to hire them, or you start, even internally start saying, oh, we're going to look at a different applicant, we're going to set this guy aside for a little while. Don't do that. Give them a copy of their report and their rights right away and document that you did that. And then once the applicant has it, pause. You take a breath, let them look at it. And they have a right under the Fair Credit Reporting Act to dispute the information back to the background screening company. So if they think something is incorrect in the report, they can come back to us and say, hey, this isn't right. Now, with imperative PFC, it is right. I mean, it's, that's just, we're really thorough, and we're a lot more expensive than the big data brokers and those guys, but we just don't make those kind of mistakes. We get that information right 99.99% of the time. Sometimes the information's wrong in the court's records. Sometimes an employer changes their tune. They tell us they're not eligible for rehire, and the applicant calls and yells at them. And then they say, okay, well, we're not going to make that determination. And they change their story. That happens, but it's extremely, extremely rare. If you're dealing with a good background check company, it should almost never happen that the information's incorrect on the background check. But give them a chance, breathe, and ask them, is there anything on this report that's incorrect? And so, like I said, our system will email it to the applicant. So I recommend clients, employers who need to move forward and they don't want to lose their next applicant waiting for the applicant to look at this, pick up the phone and call the applicant and say, hey, do you have a minute? Look at your email, and I've sent, there's a link to look at your background check, and then have them pull it up right there and look at it, and then say, okay, Sarah, I see this criminal conviction from 2015 on your report. We talked about your criminal history. You did mention that. Is this information on this report accurate? And once they tell you it's accurate, then there's nothing else to worry about. They're not going to dispute the accuracy because they just told you it was accurate. But if they tell you that's not right, it may be true. It may be true that it's not right. And we'll talk about an example of that in a minute. And in that case, I recommend employers take a breath and let's see if we can figure out what's going on here. And here's a story from our own files, our own experience, where an applicant, where there was information that looked like it belonged to an applicant, but it didn't. This was a background check for a large social services firm here in North Texas, where we're based. And this person was going to be basically a social worker, but a lead manager, supervisor person. And we're working on the background check. And one of my team brings to me concern about the report, because they said, look, we have verified his employment here in Tarrant County, Texas for the last 20 plus years. But at the same time that he was supposed to be here working, and we verified his employment and he's got this history, we're finding criminal records for him in Berkeley, South Carolina, and in Navarro County, Texas. So something doesn't seem right here. And so I said, well, let's order court copies, and we got court documents, copies of the court documents, and there were some red flags there. The social security number, one of the criminal files doesn't have a social security number in it, and most of them don't anyway, but one of them did, and we ran that, and it belonged to a woman. And so it was just, it wasn't really, clearly that person's. And so and it didn't match the social security number we had on file for the applicant, but the name was really unique. Think Obadiah, Jesse, just Ezekiel. It was a very unique name, and the records on the court matched the person's date of birth. So we thought, well, we're not going to ignore it. So we need to figure out what's going on here. So, and we got these mug shots, and so I call my client up and I say, hey, so tell me about Ezekiel over here, this applicant. And, and he says, oh, he's an amazing social worker. He's got this whole history. And I'm like, well, okay, well, describe him to me physically. What does he look like? And he said, well, he's about a 6 foot tall black guy. And I'm looking at these mug shots, and I'm like, and the other information we had on file, and we're like, okay, that's what I need to know. Thanks. And I hung up. And I turned around and I called the applicant directly and said, hey, we found these records with your name, and there's nobody else in the country that we can find with the same name and date of birth. But I don't believe they're yours. And he said, no, they're certainly not. But this explains a lot, because every time I get stopped for a traffic offense or anything like that, the police take a long time. They double check my ID, and they do a whole bunch of stuff. And it's never seemed quite right to me. And then he remembered, as we were talking, that his identity was stolen when he was in the military back in the mid-90s. And so now we know who, or at least we know what the guy looks like who stole his identity, I think. And so, but this guy, the first time he was arrested in 96, apparently was using this other person's identity and got booked in and prosecuted and convicted under this other person's identity information. And so now his fingerprints, this is all my speculation, but it looks like his fingerprints are associated with this other guy's identity. And so when this guy gets arrested, this other guy's identity comes up. And so, in fact, we helped him get with the sheriff's department in both of these jurisdictions and here in Tarrant County, and get a letter saying, hey, in case this is not that guy, in case something happens and he gets arrested or there's a new warrant and he gets pulled over. But so all of that to say, sometimes when your applicant says, it ain't me, it ain't them, probably is them, but breathe, give them a chance to dispute it back to the background screening company. And we as a background screening company have 30 days under the federal law to reinvestigate the information. Now, we've never taken more than 2 or 3 days to do it. It depends on how responsive the court clerk or the school or the previous employer, whoever provided the information that the applicant's disputing. It depends on how long they respond to us, how quickly they respond to us, but we usually close those in the same day, because often it's a matter of picking up the phone and just talking to our court clerk to verify the information, or calling that employer back to verify the information, something like that. And then we can turn that dispute around right away. But most of the time when the applicants call, we're so sweet and lovable to them. And we try really hard for it not to be adversarial. And so they talk to us. And ultimately, when we talk to them through everything with them, especially on criminal history, they'll admit, yeah, well, yes, of course, that's me. But how am I supposed to find a job if my criminal history follows me everywhere? And then I can have a conversation with them, because I've got a training program that I do for former offenders on how to find meaningful work with a record, because I think that's a really important thing. So once they've told me they're not really disputing the accuracy of information, we can move on and close the report. So, but let's say they don't dispute it, or they do, and there's no change to the report. You just still decide you're not going to take an adverse employment action on them. You are going to, you're not going to hire them. You're going to choose something else, offer them less money or a different position or whatever. Anything from their point of view that could be negative, then you have to give them another notice saying that based in whole or part on the background check, you're making this hiring decision. And that's real easy, because again, your background screening company probably has a system to provide that information at no extra cost directly to the applicant electronically. And so, but just make sure you do that, because again, that's what people are getting sued for. And it's kind of ridiculous to get sued for this at this point. So real quickly, because I'm talking to domestic staffing companies and who usually don't have more than 15 employees. And certainly most of our just straight family clients don't have more than 15 employees. Now, some of our family offices do, and the larger estates may have more than 15. And so Title VII of the Civil Rights Act may apply. So just know, and I've got a whole webinar on our website over at imperativeinfo.com about the EEOC's guidelines and the information that employers really need to understand there. But the EEOC under Title VII is concerned that because minorities are arrested, prosecuted, and convicted at a higher rate than the white population, an employer who isn't thoughtful in how they use criminal history and doesn't have a business necessity attached to how they use criminal history will create a disparate impact on people in a protected class based on race or color. So the EEOC really wants employers to examine the information, the criminal history information, how long ago it was, what did they do, and how is that conduct related to the job itself. And as I said, I've got a whole webinar on how to fairly evaluate criminal history. And it's really geared to larger clients, who have a lot of employees and different kinds of job codes, but it's still pretty helpful, I think, in just things to think through as a domestic employer or as a nanny agency about trying to figure out how you really evaluate criminal history. Plus, the EEOC wants employers to give the applicant what they call an individualized assessment. And basically what that is in the EEOC's words, they want you to give the applicant an opportunity to explain why your policy about criminal history shouldn't apply to them. Okay, so that may be, well, that was 10 years ago, and here's evidence that I'm not the person I was when this thing happened 10 years ago. I'm not the person who made that critical error in judgment or whatever. And so in the tools we share with our clients when they ask for consulting help around building their employment selection process, things like that, we include opportunities for applicants to provide that stuff right up front when you ask about criminal history. Hopefully you are asking about criminal history before you do the background check, and give them an opportunity to tell you, give you that information before you ever run the background check. So again, there's a whole webinar out there on the EEOC and how to fairly evaluate criminal history, but I just want to make sure we mention that. Now, you also need to know that I mentioned the Fair Credit Reporting Act limits the reporting of non-conviction information if the person's going to make less than $75,000 a year. But understand that some states and municipalities have limits on what background check companies can report also. There's only a handful of states where that's the case, but there may be an instance where I can't tell an employer about a criminal conviction that's 8 years old or 7 years and 1 day old. And so there are some limitations on that. And it makes me a little crazy sometimes in certain states like California, where there's information I want an employer to have, but I can't legally give it to them. But that's just the way the laws in some of those jurisdictions run. And so you should work with your background screening company and your legal counsel to figure out what applies where you are. And certainly when I'm working with clients, we'll talk to them about, oh, you're in San Francisco or you're in New York City. God bless you. And these are the problems that you're going to have there. Here's what you have to do to stay compliant in that jurisdiction. And then across the nation, there are was initially called ban the box, which meant you were going to take the criminal history inquiry out of the process until a later point. So it wouldn't be on the application. It would be after an interview or after you made an offer. And now it's called fair chance hiring because it's expanded beyond just when you ask the applicant about their criminal history to even the kinds of information that applicants can consider. For instance, in California, or employers can consider. So for instance, now California, an employer can't consider non-conviction information. And so you can get deferred adjudication in California for a lot of offenses. And deferred adjudication means you pled guilty to the offense. You've accepted responsibility for it. You did it. And in the eyes of the law anyway. And an employer cannot consider that information, however, in California, even if the person's still on probation for the offense. It wasn't a conviction. And so there are state by state and even city by city. Austin, Texas is the only city in Texas that has it, but San Francisco, Los Angeles, Madison, Wisconsin, New York City, a bunch of local cities and counties have passed these little ordinances that control what employers consider. So you need to pay attention to that again. And again, your background screening company and your legal counsel can help you with that, figure out exactly what's applicable where. So let's get into the fundamentals of background checks and what's included. First of all, this is a little gospel according to Coffey stuff. I am really convinced that employers are better served if they ask really thorough criminal history questions, really thorough questions about a person's employment history, why they left previous jobs, what their details about what their responsibilities were in those jobs, all kinds of information. Really spend time in the application process and in the interview, getting all that information, and make sure you're capturing it in writing, either ideally from the applicant, but at least in your own notes that you can understand and refer back to. That way, all the background check should be is a lie detector test. Did they tell me the truth during this process? And that way you've given them every chance to be fair. And and certainly if you want my criminal history question, my sample criminal history question, shoot me an email. I'd be glad to share that with you. It's out on our website too. And I've got a whole webinar about just how to talk to applicants about their criminal history. That's recorded out on our website. But ideally, if this is just a lie detector test, there should be no surprises when the background check comes back. Now, the reality is, and this is gospel according to Coffey, commandment number 1, if the applicant lies to you coming in the door, it's not reasonable to expect their behavior to change afterwards. And so I'm a big believer that if you've got a thorough process and you ask really good questions and there's no wiggle room in how you ask the questions, and it's really clear that you were asking a direct, straightforward question and the applicant either told you the truth or they didn't, then when the background check comes back and there's something different, you go through that adverse action process, but your decision's already made because they lied to you in the application process. And that's always a reason to, in my opinion, to exclude an applicant from consideration. So that's why we do background checks, to make sure that you're making a well-informed decision about the people you're involving in your business, your personal business, your family, your household management, inside your nanny agency, whatever it is. You want to make a well-informed decision. That means you ask them a lot of information, and then you do everything you can to verify it. So the background checks start with identity verification. Well, we should say identity research is what we call it, because most of the time we're not really verifying this person's identity. We're verifying that name and date of birth and social security number all are associated with the same person in what are called consumer reference files. Think about credit reports and other big data that's out there on all of us. That's what we're doing when we do whether it's called an SSN trace, or some background screening companies do call it ID verification, but that's not really what it is, because it's just corroboration, and we call it identity research. But you want that because it's going to give you that in that research, it's going to give you a list of names associated with that social and with that identity, and verified date of birth, and a list of addresses that are associated with that person in this big data. And so those names are important because my wife, before we were married, was Christy Gable. Today, she is Christy Coffey after 26 years in January. And that's 3 of the best years of her life. And so, but she was Christy Gable before she became Christy Coffey. And so all the misdeeds that she did before I got hold of her and straightened her out, 26 or whatever years it is, would be under Christy Gable, because all the courts records are indexed, as I said earlier, by name and date of birth, not by social. So I need to know all the names associated with somebody. And you'd be amazed what we see in court records. If somebody goes by Billy Bob, but his name's William Robert, there's still a good chance that the criminal case against him may be against Billy Bob. And so if we don't know this guy goes by Billy Bob and we're just searching in the court's computer for William Robert, we may never see it. So we need to know how this person portrays himself or herself in all these other consumer transactions in order to figure out what names to search. Plus, as I said, it gives us a good address history, and that tells us where to do research. And most background screening companies look at 5 or 7 years of address history to decide where they do research. At Imperative PFC, our standard is 10 years. We look further back, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But we look back 10 years. So all the addresses strongly associated with that person in 10 years. So this is what this identity corroboration, we are trying to verify, or at least corroborate, that this is who we're talking, that this is really who we're dealing with, and figure out what research to conduct and where on the individual. So of course, when people are talking about background checks, they're always, the first thing is criminal history, right? That's the first thing we think about. And so my disappointing answer, the first thing I want to say to you about criminal history is forget everything you've ever seen on TV. You watch shows like CSI or some other show, and they get somebody's Facebook profile or driver's license or whatever, and the next thing you know, they've got all this information on them, their whole criminal history, their 5th grade kindergarten, 5th grade school teacher's name, their college roommate, their cellie at Rikers, all of those. But in reality, they don't have that access. It doesn't, because the data doesn't exist. There's not even at the national level a reliable criminal history system that's nationwide. In fact, in 2006, the Department of Justice, talking about the FBI's National Criminal Database, explained that it's not complete, that there is no complete national database of all criminal records in the United States. So what they're doing is the FBI is collecting data from the states and from jurisdictions around the country and it's almost all felony information, and a lot of it is missing details of it. This is why you often hear about people who shouldn't be able to buy a firearm were able to buy one from a licensed firearms dealer, because the background check came back clear. Just because there's not a good national system. And in fact, if the government doesn't have one, private industry certainly doesn't have one. So you hear about companies that sell something called a national criminal database or a national criminal search or a comprehensive criminal search. Anytime they use the word national or comprehensive, they're really overselling the accuracy and the thoroughness of what they're selling you. But basically what these database companies are doing is they're going out there and they're buying the data from or downloading it from the state of Texas and maybe Dallas County over here, and maybe Maricopa County, Arizona will provide it, but New York State won't provide it. California won't provide it. Some counties provide it. Tarrant County, where I'm located here in Texas, will not provide. You can't go get all of their criminal records in a single data set and download it into your database. They will not do it. And so what they end up with is a patchwork from all over the country of criminal records, but it's missing a lot of information. Easily 60 to 70% of the information that we report to our clients doesn't show up in the so-called national databases. Now, these databases are somewhat useful, though, because they're like a safety net. If I didn't know the person ever lived in Las Vegas, Nevada, but a record pops up in this database out of Clark County for them, we know we need to go search Clark County and see if this is really them and the information is accurate and up to date. And so that's how we use so-called national databases. You'll never see from Imperative or really any good background screening company the details from the national criminal file. What you'll see is they verified it here at the county level, by going to that county courthouse and checking those records and verifying it. But that's what you get when you're ordering a national criminal file. And then a lot of states make available a statewide criminal background check, but most of those states' records aren't really reliable either. Here in Texas, a number of years, about 10 or 12 years ago, we ran everybody on death row in Texas. So they were on death row in Texas, and Texas DPS, the statewide criminal system, was missing a third of them. You couldn't even find them. That's how bad these statewide records are in many states. And so whether it's Florida, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, or Washington, the Washington State Police, almost anywhere you go, there's not, in most states, really reliable statewide criminal records. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But just know that, again, we use statewide criminal records. And when we do a statewide criminal record, we're searching the state repository if it's available. And like California, it's not available. But we're searching the Department of Corrections, the state prison records where that's available, and the state sex offender records. And so we're trying to, build as good a safety net under our other research to identify any records we may not have found through our primary research process, which is going to the individual counties where the person lived. So in Texas, there are 254 counties, and across the country, there are over 3,300 counties. Most of them have an upper level courthouse and a lower level courthouse. So now we're talking 7,000 or more courthouses across the country with criminal records. And so what we do is, like at Imperative, we look at the last 10 years of records. And so that means that last 10 years of addresses. And so if somebody lived in Fort Worth, we go to the Tarrant County Courthouse. If they lived in Austin, we go to the Travis County Courthouse. If they live down in Laredo, we go to the Webb County Courthouse. And you have to actually check the live records at those counties. That's the only way to really capture all the criminal history on somebody. And like I say, we're looking back at addresses in the last 10 years. But we will report to our clients everything we can legally report to them. And that's important because a lot of screening companies don't. They only tell you stuff. They apply California's rule to all employers nationwide and all of their clients. And so at Imperative and PFC, our plan is to give our clients everything we can legally tell them, and that, to our knowledge, they can legally use, because we don't give them the rope to hang themselves with. But that means if they lived in Las Vegas, we're going to Clark County, Nevada. If they lived in Los Angeles, we're going to Los Angeles County. If they were in New York, New York, we're checking. They've got an integrated court system, and it's all a statewide search. And so you're going to get the New York Office of Court Administration statewide in New York, and it also costs almost $100 to get it from the state. So, but that's how you get the research going. In most of these counties, we're actually having to physically send somebody to walk into the courthouse to search the records, because most of the counties around the country don't make their records available online and up to date. Some of them put their records online, but they only put their convictions online. So you don't see pending cases, you don't see deferred adjudications, maybe you don't see dismissed cases. And so we only use those online records where we've confirmed what we're actually searching are the actual records, live records of the court, and it's got everything on there. So most of the time, we're having a local researcher that we're paying to physically walk into the courthouse and do that research. That's how you get a really good criminal history. And that's the process that the Office of Personnel Management for the federal government, when they're doing clearances, that's exactly what they do. They send people into those courthouses to do that research. So that's the best process. And we only deal with risk-averse clients, and certainly families who are hiring caregivers or nannies or people like that, or nanny agencies and domestic staffing firms, are very risk-averse organizations who want to get it done right and don't want to ever have to explain to a client, well, sorry, we didn't do a good enough background check and we missed something and we're sorry for whatever negative thing happened. So that's where you find the majority of the records. 98% of the records of the criminal cases in the country come out of these local county courthouses. They're violations of state law that are prosecuted at the county or lower upper level court at a county. But then there are the federal courts, and only about 2% of the criminal records come out of the federal courts. But there are always things that employers care about: federal crimes like interstate drug and gun crimes, things like that, child pornography, embezzlement fraud, insurance fraud, arson, things like that all show up in the federal court system. And so you want to make sure you're searching those as well, because certainly those, as rare as they are, whenever you see one, it's always something that you care about. Now, employers are, as I've alluded to, concerned not just about convictions, they're also concerned about all cases filed. And as I'm consulting with clients, to the extent that they can in the jurisdictions where they're working, I encourage clients to both ask applicants about all of their criminal history, regardless of what the outcome was or how long ago it was, and evaluate that and determine, is it relevant to the job we're considering this person for now? Maybe even for a nanny, maybe a shoplifting conviction from 25 years ago isn't relevant if nothing else has happened and they've got a really solid history since then. But an embezzlement from a family from 25 years ago of $200,000, that may well qualify to prevent somebody from working in in a private household. And so, but the age of the offense is relevant, but also just because it wasn't a conviction doesn't mean you're not interested in it. For instance, deferred adjudication. About 30% of the criminal cases in the US end in deferred adjudication, which means the individual pleads guilty or no contest to the offense, and they agree to serve some sort of probation. And at the end of the probation, the case is dismissed. But that doesn't mean they didn't engage in the conduct. The case was dismissed because they completed the probation. So they don't have a conviction. But in most states, in Canton, California, and some other places, but in most states, an employer can consider deferred adjudication. And I would argue that they should, they should understand the underlying conduct. What did the person actually do? And is it relevant to the job we're considering them for? And so now deferred adjudication is one of those things where it's dismissed at the end of the case. So it's only something if the person's going to make less than $75,000 a year, you can only consider it. I can only put it in the report anyway, for up to 7 years. Now, if the person's going to make more than $75,000, the FCRA lets me report it forever. And then you have to also look at what the employer's restrictions are about what they can consider. And then there's outright dismissals. Why would we ever care about a case that was dismissed? The court said they didn't do it. No, that's not what a dismissal means. A dismissal means that they didn't get prosecuted for it. For whatever reason, the state decided it couldn't prove its case, or the person cooperated in another case as a cooperating witness, and they dismissed the case, or witnesses didn't show up, or all kinds of things happen. And so the fact that they had a case filed against them that was dismissed doesn't mean they engaged in the conduct, but it doesn't mean they didn't do it either. So what we need to do there, and even the EEOC's guidance says that employers should look at the underlying conduct and the information that's available to determine if it's reasonable to believe that person engaged in the conduct. So you have a conversation with them. And that's why in our criminal history question, we tell them, tell us about your cases, even the dismissals. And then you can have a frank conversation, and then give your background screening company those details and let them go verify it. If it's an offense that you would have been concerned about, if it had been a conviction and they told you it's dismissed because of whatever, then let's go verify it and give you that peace of mind to verify that it's accurate. So you always, where you legally can, want to really understand why a case was dismissed, what the circumstances were, and what was the applicant doing. And that's a perfectly fair question to ask. And again, I've got a whole webinar on how to talk to applicants about their criminal history, but it's a perfectly fair question to ask the applicant in most jurisdictions. So you got arrested for this and it was dismissed, the case was dismissed. So tell me what was going on. And sometimes the applicant, when you just ask that question, will tell you what was really going on. And they may tell you, well, they couldn't, I was doing this and this, but they couldn't prove it because my cousin, moved out of town and he was the only witness or whatever. But then they just told you. It's amazing how often they will just admit what they did, because they think sometimes that because it wasn't a conviction, you can't consider it. But the underlying conduct is still relevant may still be relevant to your consideration for that person in employment. So you want to, gospel according to Coffey, but wherever you can, look at dismissals as seriously as you do convictions, and dig into them and understand what happened. And then, of course, we've got wants and warrants. There are instances where people are wanted for an offense, and that's something that most background checks that I see aren't including. But it's an extra expense and it takes a little bit more time sometimes. But the reality is we've seen a couple cases where an applicant a nanny was hired and through an agency, and the family left the country, went on a European vacation, came back in, and this is a true story. And when they were coming in through customs at the airport, the nanny was taken aside and arrested because she had a warrant for her arrest for an offense that happened before she worked for that company. And in that case, the warrant had not been issued until after she was employed. So there was no case out there until after she's employed, but that nobody knew where to find her, or they weren't looking that hard. But then she ended up with a warrant eventually and got arrested for it. So doing the wants and warrants right up front and including it in as part of your background check is something that you should consider, because it is something that certainly the employer would want to know about. Now, wants and warrants are run, basically, there's a central database that the FBI keeps, and it's only those wants, and warrants where a local jurisdiction reported it to the FBI and it was serious enough that they were willing to extradite the person and go to the expense and trouble of expediting somebody for the job. But certainly those are the ones you want to know about in your background check. So let's talk real quick about thoroughness. This is basically at Imperative PFC, we have 4 different levels of criminal background check. The critical being our most thorough of our standard ones. So we have clients who do a lot more even than that. And then the diligent and the basic plus and the basic. And the main reason I'm bringing this up is the critical is if that's our most thorough, that's the one that if something went wrong, I could, and you get sued, I could sit on the stand in court or in a deposition and say that this background check was as good as or exceeds most employers' background checks. That's our benchmark. And then the diligence, you can see the check marks here. It's got the identity research, the multi-jurisdictional database, or the so-called national database, and county level research, every place that person's lived in the last 10 years. So, and you can see that gets 96% of what the benchmark report has. So just taking federal cases and state level searches out of it drops it down only by 4%. But are you willing to miss 4% of the criminal records? That's the real question. And then the Basic Plus, which doesn't have, only searches the county where the person currently lives and has a database attached to it. That gets down to 75, 76%. And then just a database by itself across all the, the hundreds of thousands of applicants we've run over the years, that only gets us down to 22% of the criminal records that we would report. So this is why all these things we talked about matter as far as thoroughness. So I'm going to go quickly through a few questions that you should ask whoever your background screening company is to understand what they're doing. And so you need to ask them in these national criminal searches, are you verifying the information before you report it to me? Are you making sure it's accurate and up to date before you give it to us? So we don't lose a candidate or offend a candidate by relying on stale data out of a database. How do you select which counties we're searching? How many years of previous address are you doing? Is it 5 years? Is it 7 years? Or is it best practice at 10 years or more? Do you include all the aliases and the spelling variations that are strongly associated with somebody when you're doing the research? Because a lot of background screening companies are only going to search the name you give them. And that's going to cost you missing a lot of records. And so you want to find out, okay, we're running an SSN trace or an identity research or something like that. What are you doing with that? And how does that drive our research? And are there extra fees and all of that? When you're dealing with criminal convictions, what limitations do you place on reporting convictions? My audience here, you're probably in a state that doesn't have limitations on reporting convictions, unless you're in a handful of places, New York and California being the most obvious. And so, but is your background screening company only reporting convictions in the last 7 years so that nationwide they're following California's rules? If that's the case, then you're missing records that eventually that may be relevant to your family's consideration of the candidate. So you need to ask that question. What limits do you place on deferred adjudication cases? Some background screening companies only report convictions and they don't even tell you about deferred adjudication. And so you need to understand, are they telling me about deferred adjudication? Are they reporting deferreds only in the last 7 years? Even if this house manager is going to make $150,000 a year, are they only telling us about 7 years of deferred when they could legally tell us about everything? And in most jurisdictions, we could legally consider it. And then finally, are you even telling us about dismissed cases? What limitations are you placing on dismissed cases? And that's a fair question. And you should understand whether you're going to get that dismissed information or not. And hopefully you'll have a process in place to consider it fairly and to get more information from the applicant and verify that information with the court. But you need to ask those 6 questions to really understand what you're buying from your background screening company. Then other things that show up in background checks, and we're running low on time, but driving history. And I do recommend that even if the person's not going to necessarily be driving in the course of their job, it's another verification of identity, because now they've got a driver's license number, a date of birth, a name, and an address that we can all match to help even further corroborate their identity. Plus, if the driver's license is suspended for some reason, that should be a red flag that you need to dig deeper into understanding what's going on with that applicant. Why is their license suspended? And are there any things we need to be concerned about? If they made claims that they attended college or that they have a degree, verify it. We see more people lying about their education or their employment history than we see lying about their criminal history. And so if somebody says, yeah, I went to Texas Christian University, or I went wherever, even if they say they didn't graduate, go ahead and verify it. And you don't even have to do that through your background screening company. If you're an agency, you could pick up the phone and call the registrar at that school yourselves and verify the information. They'll talk to you, and they'll just want to probably see a signed release. But like I said, if they lied to you coming in the door, it's not reasonable to expect their behavior to change after you hire them. So our recommendation is strongly that you always verify their claims about their education. And then if they claim any kind of licensure or certification, verify that. Whatever they claim they have, take the time to verify it, because again, a lot of those licensures and certifications are related directly to their job. But even if they're not directly related to the job, if they said they have it, go verify it. It's a phone call, or your background screening company can do it for just, a few dollars. It's not, going to be that expensive. And it's good to know that they really have the certifications that they've claimed. And then talk to their previous employers, whether it was a corporate job. And I've talked to families and nanny agencies over the years who've said, oh, well, this is their first nanny job, so we're not going to go call and verify McDonald's or wherever they worked before. But maybe you should, because again, at the very least, you're going to verify they told you the truth about where they worked and what the dates were and all of that. But if you can get hold of a supervisor and actually go from just verifying employment details to actually getting into a reference conversation about the person and their history and their work habits, and especially if they were a nanny or a caregiver of some sort, get into the details around all of that, then you have better information. And in the slides, I've got a whole bunch of questions that you can consider asking a former employer. And then credit, that's always comes up. Now, nanny agencies and household staffing companies can, in most cases, go ahead and get a credit report on a candidate. And we just have to get you approved with the credit bureaus, and they can be kind of persnickety, but we usually can get it done. But families can. So if you're a family member or a family that's looking to hire a nanny or somebody to work in the home, you're going to have to get the credit report, if you need it, from the applicant themselves. And they can go online to annualcreditreport.com and get their credit report for free. And I would just have them print it out in front of you, because we have seen cases where applicants cut and pasted off of a website and then edited it and then handed it to an employer. And the one we saw, it was a pretty much a hash job. It was pretty obvious they had done some stuff to edit it. But if you're going to do that, I would recommend you have them print it while you're right in front of you. But the real question I spend more time talking employers out of running credit, because quite honestly, credit usually doesn't tell the story you think it tells. It's the studies that are out there, and just my own experience over in HR and running this company for the last 24 years, is that most employers think credit's going to point towards trustworthiness or reliability. But the reality is people's credit goes south for a lot of reasons. And you don't get on an employment related credit report, you don't get a credit score. You just see all the trade lines and their late payments and defaults and things like that. But family members get sick, or your applicant gets sick, and there's a whole bunch of reasons. They lose a job, a family member loses a job, the economy goes south. All kinds of things happen that affect people's credit negatively. And so unless you're willing to have that kind of icky conversation, which I think you should if you're concerned about that, with the applicant, to understand what happened, and then you can often corroborate what they said against the rest of their background check, the rest of their employment history, and the other information on the credit report to see if it's really relevant. But the only time I really recommend employers consider credit is if somebody's going to be managing accounts, have access to credit cards, be making financial decisions on behalf of a company or a family or things like that, where they've got a lot of discretion in the role. But negative credit generally does not correlate to theft. So that's I spend a fair amount of time trying to talk employers out of using it, or making sure they're using it with full understanding of what the value is. Now we're just going to get in a few last items that some of our clients do include in their background checks, especially on more sensitive domestic positions, civil litigation, and bankruptcy. A lot of employers want to look into that. Who is this person sued? Who has sued them? Have they filed bankruptcy? Do they have liens or judgments against them? Again, they're trying to get a full financial picture about that may suggest risk for this person in certain environments. And certainly, if I'm placing somebody in somebody's home, I am going to be very concerned about and hyper vigilant about anything that looks like these people aren't taking care of their own business personally over a long period of time. Now, if it's just, a spouse lost a job or was sick for a year, you're going to have a bump, and then you're going to start repairing stuff. But if I see people with civil suits and they're getting evicted over here and they're getting sued by credit card companies here, and it's just, or they're suing previous employers and they're just on an ongoing basis not conducting themselves well, then I'm going to be more interested in looking at their fitness for that specific role based on that. Some employers are looking at also at social media, and that top picture back in the old days when I was in college, we'd take photos at parties, and hopefully those never got developed. Or if they did get developed, they would, they're in somebody's shoebox in their house right now, pictures of me in college, and hopefully their house burns down at some point and those pictures are all, removed. But that's the way it used to be. And then 20 years ago, we all started posting our entire lives on social media. And I'm on Instagram at Mr. Coffey, MR Coffey, and you can see my whole life out there. And so more and more employers are interested in looking at applicants' social media. And when I'm talking to job seekers about getting ready for a background check process, I tell them, clean up your social media. You got to pass the no freak test, and you've got to be look like the kind of person somebody's going to want around their family. And then, of course, we saw on January 6th that a lot of employers were suddenly aware of some of their employees' less than good judgment on January 6th in Washington, D.C. And so it's not uncommon for employers to want to search social media and its availability. The one thing I will tell you is there's a lot of $30 to $40 packages out there to search social media, and we've tested them and they're not very good. To do it well is a lot more expensive, but it gives you information that generally it's more reliable. We also have clients who often look for, especially on positions where they're going to be caring for children, especially taking those children out in public, what kind of restraining orders or civil protective orders has this person filed in the last 2 or 3 years, either or had filed against them? So, does this potential nanny who's going to be taking my kids to the park or to school or, different public things, game practices and all of that, might they have a stalker? Do they have a crazy ex who has a tendency to show up and cause problems and all that? In most employment, that wouldn't be relevant. But in the context of caring for your children in a public setting, I think it's probably very relevant. And so a lot of our clients, especially when we're working with agencies that deal with a lot of A-list, high-profile families, they're very, risk averse when it comes to their kids, and they want to at least understand what's going on. And they want to be able to talk to the applicant, say, hey, this thing, from your divorce, there's still a restraining order out on your ex-husband. Can you tell us about what's going on there? And get a sense and a feeling for, whether this might pose any risk. And unfortunately for the nannies, but in the families, sometimes they've decided not to pursue that nanny any further because of this issue that's out there, and because they want to protect, make sure their kids don't have to deal with any drama or certainly put in danger. Then we have clients who, especially again, it's high wealth estates and very risk averse clients who have us even check 911 calls and police service calls to addresses. And so are the police being called out on multiple Friday evenings to domestic violence calls or domestic disturbance calls at someone's residence? And so That's another thing that some clients ask for. And then the last additional search that we see clients, and again, it's primarily, for lack of a better term, rich paranoid people. Doesn't mean that there's not a reason to be paranoid. They will look at even cohabitants. Have us find people who used to live with this person or may live with them now, and check their check references with them. Call those former cohabitants, former roommates, significant others, or whatever, and see what they have to say about the candidate. Sometimes we've had clients also have us do background checks on the current cohabitants, spouses, roommates, things like that, because they want to know that, if this person's involved with somebody in their life who's less savory, we need to at least have the conversation with our nanny or our house manager or our housekeeper or our driver that you need to understand there's got to be clear boundaries between you and this person and your work. And we also have clients who, like private equity clients and things like that, who are concerned about conflicts of interest for certain kinds of employees, and they want to know where this person works and stuff like that. So those are all deeper dive that most of our clients will never ask for, but in most of the country, these are all perfectly legal searches, and they give you more insight. And with dealing with whether it's elder care or nannies and children, you really want to be careful about who you're putting into your lives and into your homes. And so some families find value in doing that. And my last point is the question that always comes up: should a nanny agency share the background check with the family? I know you already do anyway. But then, there's always this icky feeling, should I do it or shouldn't I do it? And my advice, and I've got a blog on our website about this, but the short version is you can do it. It's your information, and you can share that information. You own it. You pay for the background check and you got their authorization. You can share that with other people with a business need to know. And so that would certainly be the family. Now, what I'm less encouraging of is selling it to the family. So buying it from Imperative or PFC and then selling it to the actual family, that may be a problem. Included in the package as part of what you deliver, that's fine. But I don't want you to ever be in a position where you're a consumer reporting agency by selling that report, and suddenly you're liable for all the same stuff I am under federal law. And if you're using PFC or Imperative, you're not going to have problems with that because we're so strictly compliant. But you don't want to even get dragged into any dispute as potentially being the background screening company. So I wouldn't be in a position of selling them, but certainly you can share it with people who have a business need to know. Finally, I've got a podcast. If you're on the agency side, and which basically means you're an HR person, then I have a website, a podcast that drops every Thursday morning, Good Morning HR. And you can find it wherever you get your podcast or at goodmorninghr.com. Each one of them is about 30 minutes, and they're usually pretty interesting. My superpower is asking dumb questions of smart people, and they've never disappointed me. So thank you. I can't even push the right button. So thank you for joining us. If there's any questions, I'll stick around. I know we've gone just a few minutes longer than we hoped, but a lot of information there, and I hope it wasn't too much. But if you have any questions, please drop them in the question box, and I will stick around and answer them until they're all gone. Going. On. Okay, well, if there are no questions, either I answered them or I put you all to sleep. But really, if my phone number's there, my emails, you've got my email from probably a dozen things, plus you'll get an email from us when the notes and the video are ready, so you can share that. Feel free to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. Thank you for joining me today, and I wish you all the very best.